Up next on Outlook, Kentucky youth advocates. On the heels of newly elected Governor Matt Bevin's budget address to the Commonwealth, will the state's most precious asset, our children, will they suffer, or will there, as our guest on today's program is hoping, be rays of hope? Coming up, we're going to have a conversation with the director of the nonpartisan children's advocacy organization, Dr. Terry Brooks. Up next on Outlook. Stay with us. Hello and welcome to Outlook. I'm Barbara Deeb. We're so glad you joined us. On the program today, we're going to be taking a closer look at what is being done for the state's children as we welcome to the program Dr. Terry Brooks. He is the executive director of KYA, Kentucky Youth Advocates, based in Louisville, Kentucky. And I could tell you a little bit more about the organization, but let's hear it straight from I don't want to say the horse's mouth, but let's hear it from the man who knows. Yeah. Thank you for being here.
Well, first of all, Barbara, thanks so much for having us on. It's great to be in Hilltopper country. Kentucky Youth Advocates is sort of a unique organization in Kentucky for a couple reasons. Our real mission is to be the independent voice for Kentucky's children. What that means at one level is that we do not accept any funding from any government entity. So we as a nonprofit run on private donations, national foundation grants. Our view is that we can't, if we're going to be a watchdog, we can't take money from the dog we're watching. Our real focus is around policies that impact children and families. That means we do a lot of research. We do upfront lobbying, both in Washington and Frankfurt. We do a lot of public engagement, whether that's conferences or events. This past year, we, for instance, hosted a gubernatorial forum as well as an attorney general forum. So that's electoral advocacy, legislative advocacy. We at KYA have a simple but we think profound vision. We want Kentucky to be the best place in America to be young, and we try to work every day to make that vision become a reality.
Well, we talk about, as we record this program, it's on the heels of the newly elected governor's budget address, and everyone was waiting and wondering.
Right.
And we heard cuts. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of that and as it settles, let's talk a little bit more about Kentucky's children.
Sure.
In your opinion, what is the biggest issue facing the children of Kentucky? We hear a lot about poverty, we hear a lot about abuse, but man who's in the trenches, what do you see it as?
Well, there are a lot of questions about Kentucky's kids that are difficult to answer. That one is easy to answer. And unless and until we begin to address the issue of endemic poverty, other outcomes are not going to be altered. For a long time in Kentucky, almost 1 in 4 children lived in poverty. We then got to a level of 1 in 4. For the first time ever, more than 1 in 4 children in Kentucky live in poverty. We know that economic well-being affects safety. It affects achievement outcomes in school. It affects the status of children's health. So you can't talk about any aspect of being a kid without talking about economic well-being. So again, lots of issues and lots of opportunities await Kentucky's children, but absolutely the core is around poverty and economic well-being.
Now, there's a blueprint that you do through KYA, and I want to talk a little bit about that. But you're basically looking at all 120 counties. What are the issues? And I think there are 16 indices that you look at.
Right.
So what's top on that list? Does it always come out to be the dollars and cents?
Well, the blueprint for Kentucky's children is really a policy agenda, and we work with over 100 other nonprofits across Kentucky to build a consensual policy agenda. What I love about that is those nonprofits are from all over Kentucky. I also love the fact that on many issues, those groups do not agree on the day of the week, but we come together on a common agenda. And if you know Kentucky politics, which is very polarizing and very bifurcated, it's a good lesson for us, because if we can't find common ground among folks who work with kids and for kids every day, then our leaders in Frankfurt are not going to find common ground. You referenced the Kids Count report, which is in many ways sort of the blueprint for Kentucky's children. And again, what we try to do is make sure that the policies we're advancing are research-based, data-driven, pragmatic. It's not just my opinion, it's not just the opinion of our partners. So we use that Kids Count research where we look at education, health outcomes, economic well-being, community and family. We look at those 16 indicators and think, if we're here on that indicator, what are some policies that could lift all the kids in 120 counties across the Commonwealth?
That's a lot of stuff to look at, and incidentally, it's 25 years of this data.
It is.
So we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we continue on Outlook. But getting back to what we talked about in the beginning, seeing poverty is one of the biggest issues. Now, I'm sure there are ebbs and flows as the economy changes, tanks, goes up. Do you see that as well as one of the issues?
Well, unfortunately, the trajectory of poverty over those 25 years, I wish it had been uneven. I wish it had been a roller coaster so we could say, well, we may be in a downturn, but it really has not been the case. Again, as I said, what we have seen is it's tough to think about when 1 in 4 kids were living in poverty, that those are the good old days, but that's what they are. And I think there are a couple issues when you think about poverty in Kentucky. One of them, I think, is almost attitudinal, which is it's so easy to say, well, that's just Kentucky being Kentucky.
Preconceived notion
yeah, it's just,
about
that's just the way it is. The other thing is that sometimes economic well-being looks so overwhelming that, it's like, where do we even begin? So one of our goals is always to be reminding policymakers that we're not going to solve a big issue like that overnight. It doesn't have to be divided, liberal versus conservative, Republican versus Democrat, rural versus urban. So, let's try to think about, again, proven common sense and common ground ways to advance kids in all kinds of areas, including economic well-being.
And I want to talk some more about that and the rural versus urban issue as well as it relates to poverty. But most importantly, we're talking about children and advocates for children as Dr. Terry Brooks continues to join us on Outlook. We're going to take a short break and we'll be back right after this. Stay with us. Thanks for joining us. I'm Barbara Deeb. The program is Outlook, and we are Talking Heads on a mission. Our mission today is taking a closer look, almost like a periscope or a telescope, if you will, to see what's happening with Kentucky's children. What are we doing for the youth in the Commonwealth? We've got the Executive Director of KYA, the Kentucky Youth Advocates, joining us today, Terry Brooks. Dr. Terry Brooks joins us from Louisville, and we're very happy that you're here. In the first half, or the first segment of the show, we were talking about the issues facing children, specifically youth. And you've said with 25 years of data to look at and examine, the bottom line is it still remains poverty, children at the poverty level. What doesn't help with the situation is the fact that there are those in power and those who have preconceived notions of, oh, it's just Kentucky. No big deal, or it's so overwhelming we just can't even take a bite out of that. Right. So where does that leave you in your role in advocating for our youth? How do you combat that?
Well, we really try to encourage lawmakers as well as elected leaders, other folks of influence, to practice what I call the art of the possible. So if we're looking at poverty, what in the world can folks in Frankfurt do? I'll give you one example. The most effective anti-poverty strategy in this nation's history is the Earned Income Tax Credit. In fact, this area of Kentucky has a number of very robust asset-building coalitions. And this time of year, when they're helping folks file their taxes, lots of Kentuckians pull down an Earned Income Tax Credit at the federal level. We want to see that as a state tax break for families as well. So why did we look at that particular idea? First of all, as I mentioned, there's a long track record. Secondly, we know that when it comes to taxes, you had better discover something that everybody can get their arms around. The earned income
Not
tax.
just the few. Yes.
Yeah, the earned income tax credit was actually invented by Richard Nixon, and the three biggest champions were Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama. So our belief is that if Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama both agree on a tax idea, Greg Stumbo, Robert Stivers, and Matt Bevin can come around that. The other really powerful thing about that is it's putting money back on the family table in Warren County or Kenton County or Harlan. And what we know that's so powerful about that is if I'm a family and I'm getting an earned income tax credit refund, I'm not putting it in my offshore account. I'm going to spend it at the local hardware store. I'm going to get my car fixed. I'm going to go to the department
Keep
store.
it local.
So it puts money right back in the economy. It's one of those few ideas that helps families, helps local economies, and actually enhances the state budget.
Is that on the agenda for this
That
year's?
is one of the blueprint items.
one of the blueprint
and you know,
items.
it is, we all know from the way that Kentucky's budget looks that any new idea is going to be a tough one this year. We do think that there's growing support. This past session, we had a Republican senator and a Democratic senator co-sponsor. So I really believe that those are the kind of ideas, whether it happens in 2016, 2017, or
Right.
2018, that are coming down the pike that can make a difference. We also try to look at issues that at first glance you may not think are economic well-being
have an
related,
impact.
but they
Yes.
do.
Yeah.
Give you a great example is child care. Again, we know that this area of the state has particularly robust and high-quality child care efforts, but there is still sort of a donut hole where a large number of Kentuckians have to figure out, is it worth me working? Because if I have to pay child care and deduct that from my paycheck, I may actually be losing money.
I have heard these young mothers and fathers and caretakers who are having to pay those
Pretty
fees.
exorbitant
Yeah.
rates. So what if we expanded eligibility? What if we increased support? Again, that's going to allow more folks to go into the workforce. And again, it's that circle where we're not asking that we blow up the budget. Instead, we're asking folks to be smart, and by actually increasing support for early childhood, for child care, we're actually going to be helping that local economy workforce.
Across the way. You know, when we talk about this poverty issue, and we are going to get into Governor Matt Bevin's budget address and how it's going to impact the youth of the Commonwealth, but first, rural versus urban. You know, when we look at this poverty issue, you say, you know, there exist many preconceived notions, stereotypes about Kentucky and the Commonwealth. Do we see this 1 in 4 child who's in poverty? Is it geographic or is it demographic? Do we see certain areas of the state?
Well, that's not to say that there are no differences. So if you look at a Oldham County, Kenton County, a Boone County versus southeast Kentucky counties, there are certainly differences, but I actually think one of the biggest barriers we have is what is absolutely a myth, that you have rural Kentucky versus urban Kentucky, you have western Kentucky versus eastern Kentucky, and things are so different. When you get into the data, when you let that research confuse your opinions, when you let that alter your preconceived notions, what you find is it's a whole lot more a kid is a kid is a kid. I'll give you a great example, and I think it's one of the quietest revolutions going on in Kentucky, and that is that the very family structure of Kentucky is changing. We now have...
Not just Kentucky.
Well, yeah, nationally, you're absolutely right, but 1 in 3 kids in Kentucky now live in a one-parent family. Twice as many kids today live with their grandparents.
Say that again, those numbers, because that's kind of a wow. You're saying 1 in 3 children is being raised in a single-parent household.
And twice as many kids today as 10 years ago are in what we call kinship care, meaning they're being raised by a grandma or a grandpa, an aunt or an uncle. Well, those are very profound changes. And yet, if you look, what you will find is the numbers that Warren County reflects are very, very typical of those other 119 counties. We don't see, you know, that in one part of Kentucky Wally and Beaver Cleaver still live with
Right.
mom and dad, and it's
Right.
that other area. So I actually think one of the real barriers for progress for kids in Kentucky is that mythology. Is that proposal for urban kids or rural kids?
Right.
Well, it's for all
and
kids.
that mentality,
Yes,
that
absolutely.
pre-existing mentality
Absolutely.
among that. When we talk about the Kids Count Survey, which we're going to put up a website at the end of the show, and if you have time and just want to go check it out, it is kind of fascinating to see because you break it down by the different counties. So of course I am taking a look here at Warren County, but we look at education, health, family and community, economic security. How are those 16, is this when you get with the 100 other nonprofits and you decide we're going to look at these
Right.
16 indexes?
That's exactly. We really try to use that as a roadmap. It doesn't mean that everything on the blueprint is directly linked to that. Within the Kids Count book, there are a lot of other measurements like abuse and neglect are in the Kids Count book that are not necessarily on that scorecard. But we do try to take a look at it. One of the things you'll see when you look at those arenas is, for instance, this past year's report card, economic well-being, across the board was depressing. Health outcomes, frankly, across the board were encouraging. We already talked a little bit about the family and community is, in my mind, sort of this untold story. Another area that I think folks need to pay attention to is in education. Again, there are certainly exceptions to this. I know, again, locally that both Bowling Green Independent and Warren County Schools have a really good reputation on
yes.
a statewide basis. But I worry a lot that there is a lot of spin from the K-12 community that we're doing great. Well, we're doing great when you compare Kentucky to Kentucky. We're doing better than maybe we used to do. But if you look at that data, what it says is that 2 out of 3 fourth graders in Kentucky do not meet minimal national expectations. 7 out of 10 eighth graders can't do math at a nationally proficient level. Well, times have changed. I have 5 grandkids. All 5 are in public schools, elementary, middle, and high school. I want them to be able to compete with folks in Palo Alto and Plano and Providence, not just Paducah and Prestonsburg.
Yes, we're talking Rhode Island and California.
Exactly.
Yes.
So
yes.
I really think that
Nationally
another very
competitive.
quiet story in the Kids Count data is we all as a state need to wake up and really challenge the K-12 community. Don't be satisfied with being better than yourself. Instead, let's benchmark where our young people are going to be in 10 or 15 years, and
Ooh,
that's
the
competing in
yes.
a national and international market.
Internet global, that's right. We're going to take another short break here on Outlook. We're going to continue our conversation with Dr. Terry Brooks. And when we come back, we're going to talk about Governor Bevin's proposed 9% cut over the next 2 fiscal years. What's that going to mean for our youth in Kentucky? We'll find out. Stay with us. Outlook continues. I'm Barbara Deeb. We're talking today with Dr. Terry Brooks, who's the executive director of KYA, Kentucky Youth Advocates, a nonprofit, nonpartisan child advocacy group. And organization, I should say, rather than a group. It's bigger than that. And as we're recording this program, Dr. Brooks, we are on the heels of Governor Matt Bevin has come out with his budget address. Now, I think today's a day when the dust is settling. Everyone's taking a closer look and saying, how is it going to affect me? But he is proposing a 4.5% or 9% cut in the state over the next 2 fiscal years. Now, as someone who is out there advocating for the youth in the Commonwealth, how will those numbers or those projections or those kinds of things affect what you do?
Well, as you said, he gave that speech less than 24 hours ago.
Right.
So I'm not going to tell you that I've read all 4,000 pages of the budget. And there are some big areas that I just flat out don't have the answer for, like early childhood and child care. But what we saw last night, both in the governor's speech and in some preliminary analysis, was very clear that he, as governor, does have a real commitment to Kentucky's kids. I would point out 2 things that I think are so important in that speech. One is some really new dollars on the table. So we have this tough economic situation. We're cutting the budget in many areas. Among the very few areas, along with perhaps increased pay for state troopers, The other group of folks who won last night were kids. First of all, the K-12 education system's funding was sustained at the current level, so that's good news for principals and teachers throughout
and you're
Kentucky.
a former principal.
I'm
you
an
can
old,
speak
broken
from the
down,
heart.
retired educator, so
go.
that was good news. I was really impressed with a series of commitments to tackle the issues of abuse and neglect in Kentucky. If you think about that, the number of kids who were abused and neglected last year would not fit in Diddle Arena. It kind of describes the scope. The governor has laid out strengthening the child advocacy centers, which are places where kids who have been abused go to get their situation resolved. He talked about some fundamental changes in the way that those frontline workers who investigate
social workers who might have to go, yes.
So whether that's increasing
numbers,
increasing pay to try to retain talented folks in that area, that's a big commitment. The other thing that if you listen carefully and as you read the budget documents, you'll see, I think that Governor Bevin is very astute at challenging folks in his administration to let's get smart about what we're doing. And I'll give you a great example of that. For the last several years, Kentucky has been applying the least effective yet most expensive practices when it comes to child welfare. We know that absolutely the best thing you can do for a kid in trouble is to keep them close to family. So maybe that's family preservation. We already referenced kinship care. Before we pull kids from their home and put them in a residential treatment facility, what are we doing to kind of hold those families together? And what's remarkable about that is those, let's get families and protect and build them back. Let's make sure kids, if they can't stay with mom and dad, are grandma and grandpa available. Those are best for kids. They're also least expensive for the state. So if you really listened to the address and if you begin looking at line items, what you see is there's some elbow room for cabinet secretaries to say, we may not be able to get more money, so let's reconfigure what we have. Let's stretch the dollars. So I'm one of those folks that actually was very heartened by and emboldened by what I heard last night.
Emboldened? We'll go so far as emboldened.
Yes.
I've got to ask you something. Behind every great man is a great woman, right? So the First Lady, you know, we've seen over the decades that sometimes they play a very active role, sometimes they play a behind-the-scenes role. It appears that our newly elected governor, Matt Bevin's wife, is very much in favor of children and an advocate for children.
Ironically, we spent all morning of the day of his address with First Lady's staff. And what we did for a couple hours was brainstormed an amazing array of ideas that the First Lady is considering. I don't want to be the one to announce what she's doing.
Right, but
I will tell you that you're going to see a real activist in Mrs. Bevin around issues of that child welfare system, around abuse and neglect. She also has some marvelous ideas about giving kids voice. Data is really important, and it's really important to listen to smart people in Frankfurt. But it's also really important, and we can learn a whole lot about the state of Kentucky's kids by listening to Kentucky kids.
What a novel
idea.
So
the First Lady has some real interest in that. So I really believe, and we are nonpartisan, so we worked with both Mrs. and Governor Beshear. So this is not in the tank for the Bevins. But I will tell you that in the opening few months, the opening month of this administration, we have seen a real commitment to kids from both the governor and the First Lady.
Now, we're just about out of time. As if you're watching this show and you've been listening to Dr. Terry Brooks or you know of his work, as citizens of this Commonwealth, what can each and every single one of us do on behalf of children?
Yeah, terrific question. Well, first of all, I would encourage folks to become informed. I'm biased, but I would love for folks viewing your show to go to our website and look at the Blueprint for Kentucky's Children. Look at Kids Count data. Don't try to tackle 15 issues. Decide which one touches your heart. Is it around abuse and neglect? Is it those kids who are growing up in poverty? Is it about improving Kentucky schoolhouses? And every Kentuckian has a governor, a state senator, and a member of the House. So while you can make a lot of calls, I will tell you that senators and House members want to hear from constituents. And while there's a lot of technology in this world, in Frankfurt, what are called green sheets rule. If a constituent calls, the message is written down, not on an iPad, but on a green sheet of paper.
Green sheet.
And those green sheets rock Frankfurt. So what I would, there is, and I say this very kindly, but if a viewer is interested in kids, don't just sit and think about it. You can make 3 phone calls to the governor's office, to your state senator, and to your representative, and that will make a profound difference.
You can make a difference. Dr. Terry Brooks, continued success with your work.
Thank you so much, and we really appreciate you having us today.
Thank you for being here. We've been talking with the Executive Director of KYA, Kentucky Youth Advocates, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that advocates for our youth in the Commonwealth. That's going to wrap it up for this week's edition of Outlook. As always, thanks for joining us. I'm Barbara Deeb. We'll see you next time.